The hiss of the steam engine was the first and last moist thing Mabel Hart had encountered in 3 days. It bled into the dry air of High Mesa, a fleeting ghost of the green and damp world she had left behind. When she stepped from the passenger car, the sun was a hammer of pale, hot silver. It struck the dust, and the dust, a fine red powder, rose to meet her, coating the hem of her sturdy traveling dress and the toes of her worn leather boots before she even touched the splintered planks of the station platform. High Mesa was not so much a town as a temporary argument with the vast, thirsty land of the New Mexico Territory. A single, wide street baked in the late afternoon light. To her left stood a saloon, its bat-wing doors looking like tired eyelids. To her right, a general store slumped against a land office. Further on, the sharp, unadorned peak of a wooden church steeple poked the blank blue sky, a lonely finger pointing toward a heaven that felt very far away. Everything, from the horse troughs to the faces of the few men idling on the boardwalk, seemed weathered, scoured by the same persistent wind that was now tugging at the pins in her carefully coiled brown hair. The air smelled of hot wood, horsehide, and something else, something metallic and bitter, like old blood or spent ambition. This was a place where survival was stripped to the bone, a landscape that demanded grit, not grace. Mabel clutched the handle of her valise, the worn leather familiar in her palm. Inside, nestled between 2 plain blouses and a bar of soap, were the tools of her new life, a thick, cloth-bound ledger, its pages still empty, and a single folded letter. Her other hand went instinctively to the small, hard lump in her dress pocket. It was a handkerchief, the fine linen softened by countless washings, a small spray of blue forget-me-nots embroidered in one corner by her mother's hand. It had been her mother's, now it was hers, along with the memory of her mother's last words, spoken in a voice thinned by illness but still full of unbending practicality. Mabel, do not starve yourself to please the world. You eat to live. Let them choke on their opinions. A fresh gust of wind sent a tumbleweed skittering across the street, a frantic, aimless dance. Mabel watched it go, feeling a strange kinship. She, too, was unmoored, sent rolling by the winds of death and necessity. Her mother's passing had closed the door on the small seamstress shop they had run together, a business that had dwindled as her mother's strength failed. The shop was sold, the few debts paid, and Mabel was left with a modest sum, a talent for needlework that was undervalued, and a knack for numbers that most people found unseemly in a woman. She was 26 years old, built for comfort and not for speed, a fact that had earned her more than her share of sidelong glances and whispered remarks. She had her mother's good sense and her father's solid frame, a combination that made for a woman who took up space in a world that preferred its women to shrink. She straightened her shoulders, ignoring the prickle of sweat on her neck. Self-pity was a useless expense. She had a job to begin. The letter in her valise was proof of that, a position as a bookkeeper for a ranch. She had answered an advertisement in an Albuquerque newspaper, a small, discreet block of text asking for someone with a precise hand and a clear head for figures. The reply had come by post a week later. The wage was fair, the duties were clear, and the signature was plain, Boone and Sister, a family business. She had concluded. A Mr. Boone and his wife, most likely. It brought her a small measure of comfort, the thought of working within a home. For a married couple, a woman would understand the need for order, for careful accounting of flour and molasses as well as cattle and feed. A wife would be a buffer against the rougher edges of a man's world. Mabel pictured a tidy ranch house, a sensible woman overseeing the domestic sphere while her husband managed the land. Perhaps this Sister Boone was a kind woman who would appreciate Mabel's quiet competence. It was a hopeful thought, and she held on to it as she began walking toward the center of town. As she passed the saloon, the doors swung open, spilling the noise of rough laughter and the sour smell of stale beer onto the street. A pair of cowboys, lanky and sunburnt, leaned against the rail outside. One of them nudged the other. his eyes lingering on Mabel's figure with a lazy, insolent appraisal. "That's a well-fed heifer," he drawled, loud enough for her to hear. His companion snickered. Mabel's cheeks burned. A familiar, helpless heat. She kept her gaze fixed on the church steeple, her stride even, her back straight. She would not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "Let them choke!" But the words were barbs, and they found their mark, lodging deep in the soft places of her heart. This was the currency of her life, her body measured and weighed by the eyes of strangers, her worth judged by the circumference of her waist. Her thoughts were interrupted by a stern, commanding voice. "Jedediah, you will hold your tongue. There is a lady present." The voice belonged to a woman standing on the steps of the general store, a wicker basket resting on her hip. She was thin and severe. Her hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin over her cheekbones. Her dress was dark, immaculate, and without a hint of frivolity. The cowboys straightened up, their smirks fading into sullen respect. "Afternoon, Matron Hester," one of them mumbled, touching the brim of his hat. Matron Hester's gaze shifted from the chastened cowboys to Mabel. It was not a kind look. It was a thorough inventory, traveling from Mabel's sturdy boots to her full bust and up to her flushed face. The woman's lips pursed into a thin line of disapproval, a silent judgment that was somehow more wounding than the cowboy's crude remark. In that single, sweeping glance, Mabel was tried, convicted, and sentenced for the crime of her own physical existence. She gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod and swept into the store, leaving Mabel standing alone in the street, the silence now ringing with unspoken censure. So this was High Mesa, a place of open insults and silent condemnations. A wave of exhaustion washed over her, so profound it made her knees feel weak. For a moment, she considered turning around, walking back to the station, and buying a ticket for the first train headed anywhere else. But where would she go? What would she do? This was her only prospect. Her money would not last forever. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she clutched the embroidered handkerchief in her pocket. She could feel the tiny, knotted threads of the forget-me-nots against her fingertips. Eat to live. Courage was a meal, too. You had to feed it, or it would starve. She walked on, her purpose hardening into resolve. She stopped a man loading sacks of grain onto a wagon and asked for directions to the Boone Ranch. He paused, wiping a dusty forearm across his brow. "The Boone place," he repeated, his eyes assessing her with a curiosity that was more weary than unkind. "It's a good 2 miles north of town. Follow the creek bed. Can't miss it. Though there ain't much of a creek left to follow these days." "Is Mr. Boone in town?" she asked. The man grunted, a sound that could have meant anything. "Doubt it. Elias Boone keeps to himself. Hasn't had much to celebrate lately." He gestured vaguely with his thumb toward the east, between the drought burning up his grazing land and the Silver Spur Railroad wanting to bend that creek right away from him. He's got his hands full. Calhoun at the bank is squeezing him, too. Squeezing all of us. The man's voice was flat, a recitation of hardships so constant they had lost their emotional power. He looked at her again. "You got business with him." "I'm to be his new bookkeeper," Mabel said, the words sounding more confident than she felt. The man's eyebrows rose a fraction. "A bookkeeper? Well, reckon he needs one. Good luck to you. Miss, you'll need it out there." He gave her a final, pitying look and returned to his work. Mabel followed his directions, her boots sinking into the soft dust of the road leading out of town. The landscape opened up, a panorama of gray-green sagebrush, sharp-leaved yucca, and distant, haze-shrouded mesas. The creek bed was a pale, sandy scar on the earth, littered with smooth, white stones and the occasional patch of hardy tamarisk. The silence was immense, broken only by the crunch of her own footsteps and the cry of a hawk circling high overhead. Fences of weathered gray wood marched alongside the road, their posts leaning at weary angles, their wire humming with a low, mournful tune in the wind. She walked for what felt like an hour, the sun beating down on her head and shoulders. The hope she had cultivated on the train was rapidly evaporating in the dry, relentless heat. This land was harsh, unforgiving. The people seemed no different. A deep, aching loneliness settled over her, heavier than her valise. Then she saw it, set back from the road, nestled in a shallow dip of the land, was a small ranch. The house was made of thick, sun-baked adobe bricks, its lines simple and strong. A long, low porch ran the length of the front, offering a sliver of shade. A large barn, its wood bleached to the color of bone, stood nearby, its doors slightly ajar. A few thin, dusty cattle stood listlessly in a corral, their heads bowed. The place had an air of stubborn endurance. It was not thriving, but it was still standing. It was holding on. A man was working near the corral, mending a section of fence. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy, his back to the road. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a faded blue shirt and canvas trousers. Even from a distance, Mabel could see the tension in his posture. He worked not with the easy rhythm of pleasant labor, but with the grim focus of a man battling a relentless tide. As he turned to pick up a tool, the sunlight caught his face in profile. His features were stark, defined by angles rather than curves. She saw a straight nose, a firm jaw, and hair the color of dark sand, and she saw the scar, a thin, white line that cut diagonally through his left eyebrow, a permanent accent of violence on a face that was otherwise closed and still. This had to be Elias Boone. He looked nothing like the cheerful, prosperous rancher she had imagined. He looked like the land itself, weathered, enduring, and carrying his wounds in plain sight. He moved with a quiet intensity that felt both formidable and deeply solitary. There was no sign of a wife, no children playing in the yard, no sign of the welcoming sister from the letter. There was only this man, alone under the vast, indifferent sky, wrestling with a broken fence. Mabel stopped at the wooden gate that marked the entrance to the property. Her heart beat a little faster. This was it, the start of her new life. She looked from the struggling ranch to the solitary man, and then down at the letter she had pulled from her valise, smoothing it with her thumb. The signature, Boone and Sister, seemed to mock her now. The tidy domestic picture she had painted in her mind dissolved into the shimmering heat. A feeling of profound unease took its place. She had built her hopes on a misunderstanding, a flimsy foundation of ink and assumption. Now, faced with the stark reality of the man and his land, she understood that whatever awaited her here, it would not be easy, and it would not be what she had expected. The wind picked up, blowing a fine sheet of red dust against her face, a gritty, unwelcome kiss. Welcome to High Mesa. Saturday arrived with the same dry heat as the days before, but the air in High Mesa was different. It was thicker, churned into a haze of red dust by the wheels of wagons and the hooves of 100 nervous animals. The Saturday cattle market was the town's heart, and today it was beating a frantic, noisy rhythm. Mabel Hart, having spent 2 nights in a small, clean room at the boarding house, made her way toward the auction pens. Her valise left behind, but the purpose of her visit clutched tightly in her hand the letter from Boone and Sister. She had decided it was best to approach Mr. Boone in a public place, to formalize their arrangement before venturing out to the isolation of his ranch again. The market was a maelstrom of sound and smell. Auctioneers chanted their hypnotic, rapid-fire litanies from raised platforms. Cattle bawled in crowded pens, their bodies slick with sweat and fear. Men shouted bids, their voices raw and competitive, their faces shaded by the wide brims of sweat-stained hats. The air was heavy with the scent of manure, leather, and cheap whiskey. Mabel felt small and out of place, a ship in a calico dress adrift on a sea of denim and dust. She navigated the crowded lanes, her practical nature assessing the quality of the livestock, a habit ingrained from years of understanding the value of good material. whether it was wool broadcloth or living horseflesh. It was then that she saw the mare. She was shoved into a small, overlooked pen at the edge of the market, a place for the culls and the lost causes. Her coat was the color of weak coffee, dull and matted with dirt. Her ribs stood out like the slats of a broken barrel, and her hip bones were sharp, pitiful shelves. She stood with her head hung low, her ears drooping, a picture of utter defeat. But as Mabel drew closer, she saw the horse's eye. It was large and dark, and in its liquid depth, there was not emptiness, but a deep, weary intelligence. The animal was not stupid or broken. She was simply starved of hope. "The auctioneer for this sorry corner of the market," a man with a stained vest and a bored voice, gestured toward the pen. "All right, boys. What am I bid for this fine specimen of glue and leather? Good for nothing but the knacker's yard. Let's start at $1. Do I hear $1? A few men chuckled. The horse was a joke, a piece of living debris to be cleared away. No one raised a hand. Mabel felt a hot, sharp pang in her chest. She thought of her mother's final days, the way her strong frame had withered, the light in her eyes dimming. She thought of her own journey here, a solitary woman rolling toward an unknown future. This horse, discarded and deemed worthless, was a reflection of all her own quiet fears. $1, Mabel said. Her voice was clear, though not loud, but it cut through the men's laughter like a clean stitch. The auctioneer squinted, locating her in the small crowd. "The lady bids $1, he announced, a note of amusement in his voice. The men turned to look at her, their faces, which had been merely indifferent a moment before, now filled with a kind of cruel merriment. Jedediah, the cowboy from the saloon, was among them. "Well, looky here," he shouted, a wide grin splitting his face. "It's Fat Mabel buying herself a snack." The name, ugly and sharp, hung in the air. A wave of laughter rolled through the men. "What's a woman like you want with a bag of bones?" Another one called out, "Planning on eating it to keep your strength up." The heat in Mabel's cheeks was instant and overwhelming. She felt as though she had been stripped bare in the center of town, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She stared straight ahead at the auctioneer, her chin lifted, refusing to look at her tormentors. From the corner of her eye, she saw Matron Hester standing near the edge of the crowd, her face a mask of rigid disapproval, her gaze a cold, sharp jab. $2, a gruff voice bid from the other side of the pen, a man looking to make sport of her. $3, Mabel countered immediately, her voice tighter now. The money was from the small sum her mother had left her, her emergency fund, the barrier between herself and destitution. It was a foolish, reckless thing to do. "She's serious," someone crowed. The bidding went on, a game for the onlookers, a slow, painful bleeding for Mabel. $4, $5, $6. Each bid she made was met with another jeer, another comment about her size, her appetite, her audacity. Finally, at $7, a sum that made her stomach clench with anxiety, the sport ended. The other bidder shrugged and backed away, laughing. "Sold," the auctioneer cried, banging a small wooden gavel against the rail. "To the lady with the big heart and the big purse." He winked at the crowd, which roared with appreciation. Mabel ignored them all. She walked to the auctioneer's stand, her back ramrod straight, and counted out the silver coins into his hand, as she turned, fumbling with her coin purse. A single silver dollar slipped through her fingers and fell into the thick dust. Before she could bend to retrieve it, a large, calloused hand reached down and picked it up. The hand belonged to Elias Boone. He had come upon the scene unnoticed, his presence as quiet and solid as an old stone. He stood over her for a moment, his shadow falling across her. He did not look at the laughing crowd. His gray eyes, shadowed by the brim of his hat, were fixed on her. He held out the coin. His face was unreadable, a landscape of planes and angles, the fine white scar over his eye the only landmark. "You dropped this, miss," he said. His voice was low and even, a gravelly sound that seemed to absorb the noise around them. "Thank you," Mabel murmured, taking the coin. Her fingers brushed against his, and she was surprised by the warmth and roughness of his skin. He did not move away. Instead, his gaze shifted to the pen where the skinny mare now stood, watching them. Elias looked at the horse, his eyes narrowed in professional assessment, taking in the poor conformation, the obvious signs of neglect. Then he looked back at Mabel, at the way her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, at the defiant set of her jaw, and then he looked at her eyes. He saw the hurt there, but beneath it, he saw an iron resolve that the crowd's stupid cruelty could not touch. Mabel cleared her throat, deciding this was as good a time as any. "Mr. Boone," she asked, pulling the letter from her pocket. "I believe you are expecting me. I am Mabel Hart, the new bookkeeper." She held out the folded paper. Elias Boone looked at it, then back at her, and a flicker of something, confusion or surprise, crossed his face. He took the letter and opened it. He read the familiar handwriting, his brow furrowing. He looked up, his expression more guarded than before. "This letter," he said slowly, "was written by my sister." Mabel's carefully constructed image of a tidy family business collapsed. "Your sister," she repeated, confused. "The signature says Boone and sister." "Yes," he said, "June Boone. My brother-in-law passed 2 years ago. She and her boy live with me. She handles the house. And, it appears, the hiring of bookkeepers." His tone was dry, and Mabel could not tell if he was angry or amused. A new and more complicated kind of embarrassment washed over her. She had made a complete fool of herself, assuming a wife, a partnership, a life that did not exist. She had walked into this man's world on a foundation of pure fantasy. A new thought struck her, cold and sharp. This June Boone, his widowed sister living with him. Perhaps their arrangement was more than familial. Perhaps they were betrothed. The West was full of such practical arrangements. Mabel took a half-step back, creating a more formal distance between them. Elias, in turn, watched her withdrawal, his own mind working. This woman arrived in town, made a public spectacle of herself buying a useless horse, and now presented a letter from his sister. He was a man who owned land, however troubled. Unmarried women did not just appear out of thin air to keep books. He wondered if this was some kind of arrangement his sister had cooked up, a subtle and unwanted piece of matchmaking. The thought made him deeply uncomfortable. Before either of them could speak again, a portly, well-dressed man approached them, a gold watch chain gleaming against his waistcoat. His face was fleshy and pink, his smile thin and unpleasant. It was Silas Calhoun, the town banker. "Boone," Calhoun said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. He nodded curtly at Mabel, dismissing her with a glance. "I trust you have been thinking about our conversation. 60 days is not a long time. The note comes due, and the Silver Spur Railroad is very eager to begin its survey. That new injunction on the water rights will be in effect by then. Progress waits for no man, especially not a man who cannot pay his debts." Elias Boone's posture did not change, but a cold stillness settled over him. "I am aware of the date." "Calhoun," he said, his voice flat. "Good," the banker said cheerfully. He clapped Elias on the shoulder, a gesture of false familiarity that was more of a threat than a comfort. "Just a friendly reminder. Do try to enjoy the market." He gave Mabel another dismissive look, taking in her full figure and the pathetic horse in the pen, and a small, knowing smirk touched his lips before he turned and walked away. The air he left behind was poisoned with tension. The weight of the 60-day deadline pressed down on them. Ruin was not a distant possibility. It was a date circled on a calendar. The jeers of the crowd, the banker's threats, the crushing weight of the drought. It all swirled around Elias Boone, and in the middle of it all stood this strange, stubborn woman who had just spent her own money on a dying horse. He looked at her, at the letter still in his hand, at the flush still high on her cheeks. He saw her foolishness, her compassion, and her grit, all tangled up together. He needed help. He needed a miracle. What he had was a woman with a head for figures and a heart too soft for this country. Mabel met his gaze, her own resolve hardening. She had been humiliated and misjudged. She had stumbled into a situation far more complicated and desperate than she had imagined. The easy thing to do would be to walk away, but the sight of the banker's smug face, the memory of the cowboy's laughter, and the quiet, desperate plea in the thin mare's eyes all combined to forge a new and unexpected purpose within her. She would not run. Elias folded the letter and handed it back to her. He seemed to come to a decision. His gaze was direct, stripped of all pretense. "If you still want the work," he said, his voice low and serious, "the offer stands. I need a person who can keep the books straight, someone to watch the stores, make sure we are not cheated on weights, someone who can negotiate the price of hay without flinching. The pay is as my sister promised. The work is hard, and the prospects are poor." It was not a welcome. It was a challenge, a laying out of harsh facts. Mabel looked from his scarred face to the struggling ranch she had seen the day before. She looked at the bony mare waiting for her. Here it was, a life stripped to its essential elements, a fight for water, a battle against debt, a struggle for dignity. It was a fight she suddenly realized she was ready for. This was not just about saving a stranger's ranch. It was about saving herself. "I still want the work," she said, her voice steady. A long moment passed. Elias Boone gave a single, slow nod. He turned his attention to the latch on the pen. "Let's get your horse," he said. Later, as Elias fashioned a makeshift rope halter, Mabel stroked the mare's neck. The horse flinched at first, then leaned into her touch, letting out a long, shaky sigh. The animal's bony shoulder felt fragile beneath her palm. "What will you call her?" Elias asked, his back to her as he worked the rope. Mabel ran her hand over the horse's pale, dusty coat. "Buttermilk," she said softly. It was a gentle, humble name, a name that promised nourishment and simple comfort. It was a promise to the horse, and, though she did not yet know it, a promise to herself. As she led the unsteady animal out of the pen, leaving the noise and cruelty of the market behind, Buttermilk became the first quiet witness to the 60-day war that had just begun. The journey to the Boone Ranch was a silent one. Elias walked ahead, leading the pack mule that carried Mabel's valise, his shoulders set in a line as straight and unyielding as the fence posts that dotted the landscape. Mabel followed with Buttermilk, the mare's steps slow and faltering, her own thoughts a swirl of apprehension and stubborn pride. When they arrived, a woman came out onto the adobe house's shaded porch. She was slender and wiry, with Elias's same serious gray eyes and a braid of dark hair coiled neatly at the nape of her neck. She wiped her hands on an apron, her expression one of weary curiosity. A small boy of about 5 peered out from behind her skirts, his thumb tucked firmly in his mouth. "This is Miss Hart," Elias said, his voice flat. It was not an introduction so much as a statement of fact. "She will be handling the books. This is my sister, June Boone, and her son, Toby." June's gaze was direct, taking in Mabel's dusty dress, her full figure, and the skeletal horse at her side with a single, comprehensive sweep. There was no welcome in her eyes, only a deep, pragmatic assessment. The advertisement was for a bookkeeper. "Miss Hart," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "not a veterinarian." "The horse was an unforeseen expense," Mabel replied, her cheeks warming. She was headed for the knacker's yard. June looked from Mabel to her brother, an entire conversation passing between them in a shared, silent glance. It spoke of lean times, of another mouth to feed. of a foolishness they could not afford. But Elias gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head, and June's expression softened from judgment to resignation. "Well," she said, sighing, "there's fresh water in the trough. See that she drinks. I will show you to your room." The days that followed fell into a rhythm of relentless work. Mabel's room was small and clean, with a narrow bed and a small window that looked out onto the dusty corral. Her first task was to make sense of the ranch's finances. Elias gave her a wooden crate filled with a chaotic jumble of receipts, IOUs scrawled on scraps of paper, and tally sheets from cattle sales going back years. For 2 full days, Mabel sat at the small kitchen table, the scent of baking bread mingling with the dry, papery smell of old accounts. Under the steady glow of an oil lamp late into the night, she brought order to the chaos. With neat, precise penmanship, she created her first real ledger for the Boone Ranch, a clean grid of columns for income and expenditures. When she was finished, she presented the book to Elias. He took it, his large, rough hands looking clumsy holding the pen. He stared at the pages, at the neat lines and the stark, unforgiving numbers. He saw, in black ink, the truth of his own desperation. He saw the looming 60-day deadline for the banknote, a figure that seemed to scream from the page. "According to this," Mabel said, her voice calm and professional, "you cannot afford to buy another sack of salt, another box of cartridges, or another pound of nails for at least a month. Not if you intend to have enough to buy feed should the rains fail to come." Elias traced a line with his finger, his jaw tight. He knew all this, had felt it in his gut for months, but seeing it laid bare was like looking at an open wound. "The land provides," he said, the words a hollow echo of a more hopeful time. "The land is tired, Mr. Boone," Mabel countered gently. "And your creditors are not—" "But," she continued, turning a page, "I have an idea. The straw from the last threshing is piled behind the barn. It is too coarse for feed, but the freight company in town uses it for packing. I propose we trade that straw, which is of no value to you, for a reduced rate on shipping your next cattle sale. It will not save much, but it will save something." Elias looked at her, truly looked at her. For the first time since she had arrived, he saw not a soft woman playing at business, but a shrewd mind that saw value where he saw only waste. He had been so focused on the big fight, the battle for water and survival, that he had overlooked the small skirmishes that could be won. He slowly nodded. "All right, Miss Hart," he said. "We will try it your way." It was the first seed of trust, a tiny green shoot in the parched soil of his doubt. A few days later, that trust was put to a greater test. While walking the property line with Buttermilk, who was slowly gaining a little flesh on her bones, Mabel noticed something odd, a freshly driven wooden stake. Its top painted a bright, jarring red. Stood a good 20 feet inside the Boone property line, right where the land dipped toward the creek. It was a survey marker, and it was new. It bore the emblem of the Silver Spur Railroad. She found Elias sharpening an axe blade by the barn, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone filling the quiet air. She told him what she had seen. He stopped his work, his face hardening into a grim mask. "Pike," he said, the name a curse. "Their foreman. He's pushing the line, trying to claim the best access to the water before the injunction takes effect." "The marker is wrong," Mabel said with certainty. "The wood is too new. It has not weathered a season. The original line is marked by the old stones. Is it not?" "It is," Elias agreed. "But the stones are half buried. Pike will claim they are just rocks. It's my word against the railroad's map." "Then we must make a new map," Mabel declared. She thought for a moment, her mind, accustomed to the logic of patterns and measurements, seeing a solution. "My father was a surveyor's assistant before he took up shopkeeping. He taught me the old ways. We can remeasure the line ourselves, using a Gunter's chain. We will follow the original deed's description and find the old stone markers. We will make a record." Elias looked at her, a skeptical glint in his gray eyes. "You know how to use a chain." "I know that a chain is 100 links, and that 10 square chains make an acre. I know that facts, when properly recorded, are harder to dispute than a man's anger." The next morning, they set out at dawn. Elias carried his rifle, its long barrel resting in the crook of his arm. Mabel carried the heavy ledger and a piece of charcoal. It was a strange procession, the grim, armed rancher and the determined, full-figured woman, marching out to meet a corporation's greed with 100 iron links and a book of empty pages. They found the first stone marker, a large piece of granite half swallowed by the earth, exactly where the deed said it should be. They spent the entire day measuring, stretching the chain, driving temporary pins, and recording the bearings and distances in Mabel's ledger. It was grueling work under the hot sun, but a silent understanding grew between them. He respected her precision, and she respected his quiet, watchful strength. When they were done, they had a new, hand-drawn map that showed the Silver Spur's stake was undeniably, provably on Boone land. Her quick thinking was not confined to the ranch. At a small auction for winter feed the following week, Mabel found herself once again the subject of public scrutiny. Foreman Pike was there, a burly man with a sneering face, surrounded by a few of his railroad men. When Mabel began to bid on a small but high-quality lot of alfalfa hay, Pike began to bid against her, not because he needed the hay, but to drive up the price and mock her. "Look at that," he called out to his men. "Miss Boone's new housekeeper is bidding. Must be looking to fatten up the stock. And herself." The men laughed. Mabel felt the familiar sting, but this time it was mixed with a cold anger. She did not back down. She continued to bid, her voice steady, watching the auctioneer. Then, just as the price reached a point she knew the Boone ranch could barely afford, she did something unexpected. She stopped. Pike, caught up in his own game, automatically placed one more bid. The auctioneer's gavel fell. "Sold to Foreman Pike." Pike's face fell, his sneer turning to a look of stupid confusion. He was now the owner of a very expensive pile of hay he did not need. The laughter in the crowd changed direction, now aimed at him. As Mabel turned to leave, Pike glared at her. What kind of trick was that? Mabel met his glare without flinching. It was no trick. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying in the sudden quiet, "I simply raise my bids with my mind, not with my waist." A few of the local ranchers, men who also despised the railroad, let out appreciative chuckles. She had won no great victory, but she had drawn a line, not with a surveyor's chain, but with her own sharp wit. Back at the ranch, her relationship with June was slowly thawing. The younger woman was fiercely protective of her brother and her son, and she had initially viewed Mabel as another burden, another uncertainty. But she could not deny Mabel's competence. She saw the order Mabel brought to the chaotic accounts. She saw the way Buttermilk was slowly beginning to look like a real horse under Mabel's patient care. And she saw the way her son, Toby, had begun to follow Mabel around like a quiet little shadow. One afternoon, Mabel was mending Elias's saddle, the thick leather worn and the stitching frayed near the cinch. Her hands, nimble from years of fine needlework, moved with practiced skill, pushing the awl through the tough hide and pulling the waxed thread taut. Elias came into the barn and stopped, watching her. Her head was bent in concentration, her brow furrowed slightly. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked, his voice startling her. Mabel did not look up from her work. In the quiet moments, she said, "I learned to mend leather and canvas on the days when no one wanted to hire a seamstress to work on silk or lace. A strong stitch is a strong stitch. Mr. Boone, it does not care what it is holding together." In that simple statement, he heard the story of a lifetime of being underestimated, of turning necessity into a skill. The small victories were soon overshadowed. Foreman Pike was not a man to be trifled with. A few mornings after the hay auction, Elias discovered a long section of their north fence had been cut, the wire snipped clean through. 5 head of cattle were missing. There was no doubt who was responsible. Elias's face was a thundercloud, his hand resting on the stock of the rifle that now seemed to be his permanent companion. But while he stared at the horizon in rage, Mabel knelt in the dust. She meticulously counted the hoof prints. Noting the direction they headed, she sketched the unique tread of the shod horses that had accompanied them. She recorded everything in her ledger: the date, the time, the number of missing animals, the nature of the damage. "Anger will not get your cattle back," she told him quietly. "But a record might. A fact is a stone. You can build on it." Not all was grim determination. There were moments of lightness, small pockets of peace in the midst of the struggle. One evening, to celebrate a small trade she had made for a jar of molasses, Mabel decided to teach Toby how to make taffy. In the warm, lamplit kitchen, she showed the little boy how to boil the dark, sweet syrup with butter and vinegar. June watched from a chair in the corner, a rare, soft smile on her face as her son, his face smeared with sweetness, laughed with a joy she had not heard in a long time. They pulled the hot, sticky candy, their hands buttered, stretching it into long, satiny ropes. The kitchen filled with warmth, laughter, and the rich smell of burnt sugar. Elias, drawn by the unusual sound of merriment, stood in the shadows of the doorway. He watched the scene: his sister, her guard finally down, his nephew, his eyes bright with delight, and Mabel, her face glowing in the warm light, a smudge of molasses on her cheek. He saw a life he had forgotten was possible, a moment of simple, uncomplicated happiness in a house that had been silent with grief and worry for too long. And for the first time since she had arrived, Elias Boone smiled. It was a small thing, a slight upward turn of his lips, but it was a beginning. The seed of justice, like the seed of trust, was planted in an unexpected place. The banker, Silas Calhoun, held a small auction of unclaimed goods and office surplus to clear space in his storeroom, on a whim. Mabel bid on and won a large, dusty box of old stationery and discarded ledgers for 2 bits, thinking the paper could be used for scrap. Back at the ranch that night, she was sorting through the box when she found it. Tucked inside a ledger from a failed mercantile was a single, folded receipt. It was a carbon copy of a cash interest payment made by a local farmer whose ranch had been foreclosed on by Calhoun's bank a year prior. At the bottom, in Calhoun's own elegant script, was a notation indicating an interest rate nearly double the legal limit set by the territory. Mabel stared at the flimsy piece of paper. It was a mistake, a piece of administrative carelessness on the banker's part. He had gotten rid of the wrong box, but in her hands, this small, forgotten document was not just paper. It was a weapon. It was a fact. It was a stone, solid and heavy, just waiting for the right moment to be thrown. The practical education of Mabel Hart began in earnest. The world of the ledger, with its neat columns and predictable sums, was replaced by a classroom of endless dust and sky. Elias taught her the subtle language of the land. He showed her how a shift in the wind's direction could foretell a storm, how the behavior of birds could signal the presence of water, and how the color of the evening sky was a more reliable calendar than any printed in an almanac. She learned to ride not for pleasure, but for purpose, her seat in the saddle becoming more confident each day as she helped him move the small herd from one patch of meager grazing to the next. He taught her how to drive cattle through a dry ravine, a slow, patient process of pressure and release, of understanding the collective, fearful mind of the herd. "You do not force them," he explained, his voice a low rumble against the sound of plodding hooves. "You persuade them. You show them the path is safe, and they will follow." In return, she taught him the art of quiet negotiation. When a feed merchant came to the ranch, Elias, whose default was a grim, silent stubbornness, was ready to either pay the asking price or send the man away with a curse. Mabel intervened. She invited the merchant to sit, offered him a cool drink of water, and then, holding her ledger, she sat in silence. She let the merchant talk, letting him fill the quiet with his own justifications for the high price. She listened patiently, her expression neutral. The silence stretched, becoming a tangible presence. The merchant, accustomed to haggling and argument, grew uncomfortable. He began to bargain against himself, lowering the price bit by bit, trying to coax a response from the calm, attentive woman before him. In the end, Elias got his feed for a price lower than he had thought possible. "How did you do that?" he asked her later, a note of grudging admiration in his voice. "Most men of business are uncomfortable with silence," Mabel said, wiping the kitchen table. "They assume it means disagreement. They feel the need to fill it, and usually, they fill it with concessions." Elias filed the knowledge away. He was learning that there was more than one way to be strong. Their fragile partnership was forged in fire one blisteringly hot afternoon. They were in the north pasture, a place of dry, brittle grass that crackled underfoot. When Mabel saw it first, a thin, dark finger of smoke rising against the pale blue sky to the west. A dry lightning strike. Elias saw it a second later, and every muscle in his body went rigid. "Wind's coming from that direction," he said, his voice tight with a terrible urgency. "It will be here in an hour." The fire moved with an unnatural speed, a hungry orange line consuming the gray-green landscape. Panic, hot and sharp, seized Mabel's throat. But the sight of Elias's controlled, focused movements steadied her. There was no time to save the fences or the open range. Their only hope was to protect the heart of the ranch, the house, the barn, the well. Elias began clearing a fire break, a wide swath of bare earth, using a team of mules to drag a heavy plow. The work was brutal, slow, the mules straining against the hard-packed ground. The air grew thick and hot, smelling of ash and terror. Mabel saw the half-finished frame of a new chicken coop that Elias had been building, its raw pine timbers standing vulnerable between the barn and the approaching flames. If it caught, the sparks would surely leap to the barn roof. There was not enough time for the plow to reach it. An idea, born of desperation, took hold. She ran to the small corral where Buttermilk stood, her eyes wide with fear at the smell of smoke. Mabel gentled the nervous mare, her voice a low, soothing murmur. She fashioned a crude harness and hitched the horse to a small, single-blade cultivator she had seen behind the barn. With June and Toby safely in the root cellar, Mabel led Buttermilk to the coop. The horse, trusting the familiar hands, leaned into the work. Mabel guided the plow, her arms straining, her face black with soot, carving a circle of dark, bare earth in the pail, dry grass around the wooden frame. The heat was a physical blow, the roar of the approaching fire a deafening monster's growl. Embers rained down around them, small, glowing seeds of destruction, just as the fire reached the edge of their makeshift break. Elias was there, beating at the leaping flames with a wet sack, his face a mask of grim determination. Together, they held the line. The fire, denied its fuel, swept past them, a wave of heat and fury, leaving behind a blackened, smoking wasteland. By nightfall, the danger had passed. The land was a dark, wounded thing, glowing with red embers under the moonless sky. The air was cool now, but it still carried the bitter tang of smoke. Elias walked the perimeter of the saved yard, his steps heavy with exhaustion. The chicken coop stood untouched, a small island of pale wood in a sea of black. He looked at Mabel, who was giving Buttermilk a bucket of precious water. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that without her, the barn would be gone, the ranch would have been lost. Later, they sat on the edge of the porch, too weary to speak. June had taken Toby inside to sleep, leaving them alone with the immense, quiet dark. The only sound was the chirping of crickets and the distant, mournful cry of a coyote. Mabel hugged her arms around her knees. The events of the day had stripped away all her defenses, leaving her feeling raw and exposed. She spoke into the darkness, her voice barely a whisper. They call me fat. It was a simple statement, a confession of the name she had been called at the market, a name that had followed her all her life, a summary of all the silent judgments she had endured. Elias did not answer right away. He looked out at the scarred land, then at the solid, capable woman beside him. He remembered her face, streaked with soot, her eyes fearless as she led the horse against a wall of flame. He remembered her hands, so nimble with a needle, holding the plow steady. He thought of her mind, so quick and clear, finding solutions where he saw only problems. He turned his head and looked at her, his gray eyes soft in the faint starlight. He smiled, a slow, tired, genuine smile. "I need warm arms," he said, his voice quiet but clear, not a tiny waist. The words were a balm, a cool hand on a fevered brow. They did not dismiss her hurt, they redefined her worth. They were the most beautiful words Mabel had ever heard. She did not know what to say, so she said nothing. She simply sat with him in the quiet, and for the first time in a very long time, she did not feel alone. A warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. Elias never presumed upon that moment. He did not try to touch her or offer words of affection he was not yet ready to speak. Instead, he showed his growing respect in practical ways. He noticed the section of the porch roof above her favorite sitting spot was warped, and he spent a morning fixing it, ensuring she had a dry place to sit when the rains finally came. When he saw the dark circles of fatigue under her eyes after she had stayed up late helping a cow through a difficult birth, he began to divide the night watch with her, insisting she get her rest. These were small, silent gestures, but they were the language he knew best. They were the actions of a man who was beginning to care and to protect. The town, however, had its own language, and it was often cruel. On Sunday, at the small church service, Matron Hester cornered another of the town's prominent women near the refreshment table. "It is a shame," she said, her voice a sanctimonious whisper, "how that large woman has insinuated herself into the Boone household. A man in a desperate state is so easily taken advantage of by feminine wiles." June, who was standing nearby pouring a cup of lemonade for Toby, overheard every word. The June of a month ago might have agreed, or at least stayed silent. But this was a new June, a woman who had watched Mabel save her home and treat her son with a kindness that was as natural as breathing. She set the pitcher down with a firm click. She turned and faced Matron Hester, her gray eyes as hard and direct as her brother's. "Matron Hester," she said, her voice clear and carrying, causing several conversations to falter. "That woman, Miss Hart, saved my home from burning to the ground. She works harder than any two men I know, and she has more honor in her little finger than some people have in their entire bodies. My brother is fortunate to have her. Our family is fortunate to have her." She took Toby's hand and walked away, leaving Matron Hester with her mouth slightly agape, her face flushed with public rebuke. A few days later, Elias was repairing a section of barbed wire fence that the fire had weakened when a strand snapped back, lashing across his forearm. It was not a deep cut, but it was long and jagged, bleeding freely. He came back to the house, wrapping a dirty kerchief around it, his face pale beneath his tan. Mabel took one look and clicked her tongue. She sat him down at the kitchen table as if he were a child, washing the wound with clean water and soap. "This will sting," she warned, uncorking a bottle of whiskey that was kept for medicinal purposes. "I am not afraid of a little sting," he grumbled, though he eyed the bottle warily. When the alcohol touched the raw flesh, he hissed, his entire body jerking. Mabel could not help it. A small laugh escaped her. "Brave rancher," she teased, her touch gentle as she blotted the wound dry. "Fights fire and bankers, but is brought to his knees by a drop of whiskey." He looked up at her, a reluctant smile touching his own lips. "It is a tactical retreat," he said. Her face was close to his, her brow furrowed in concentration. He could smell the clean, faint scent of soap and starch that always clung to her. The moment was simple, domestic, and more intimate than any they had shared. She finished bandaging his arm, her movements efficient and comforting. Their hands touched, and for a moment, neither of them pulled away. The fragile peace was broken a week later. Elias rode into town and heard that the county survey team, paid for by the railroad, had been seen out near his property. A cold knot of dread tightened in his stomach. He rode straight to the northern boundary, to the place where he and Mabel had used the Gunter's chain, where they had found the old stone markers. He found the surveyor's fresh tracks in the dust, but the stones, the ancient, half-buried granite markers that had anchored his family's claim to this land for a generation, were gone. There was only disturbed earth and a few deep pits where they had been pried from the ground. Foreman Pike had not just pushed the line, he had erased it. Their hand-drawn map, their careful measurements, were now just lines on a page with nothing on the ground to prove them true. The day of the water measurement dawned clear and mercilessly bright. It was not a formal trial in a robed courtroom, but a hearing held in the dusty main room of the High Mesa Land Office, a space that smelled of old paper and stale tobacco. A circuit judge from Santa Fe, a man named Hargrove with a weary face and spectacles perched on his nose, had been sent to adjudicate the dispute. The room was crowded. On one side stood Foreman Pike, flanked by a lawyer in a city suit sent by the Silver Spur Railroad. On the other stood Elias, his face carved from stone, his hands resting on his thighs. June sat a row behind him, her posture rigid, and beside Elias sat Mabel, her hands folded over the thick, cloth-bound ledger in her lap. Pike and his lawyer went first. They unrolled a large, professionally drafted map on the judge's table, a beautiful document of crisp lines and elegant lettering. It showed the Boone property, the creek, and the proposed diversion point. It was, the lawyer argued, an unimpeachable survey conducted with the latest equipment. He pointed to the location of the new red stakes. The old boundary, he claimed, was based on folklore and misplaced rocks, not on scientific measurement. Mr. Boone's attachment to his father's land is understandable, Your Honor, the lawyer said with an oily smile. But progress requires precision. The railroad brings prosperity, and that prosperity requires water for its new depot and workyard. This is a matter of public good versus private sentiment. Judge Hargrove peered at the map over his spectacles. He looked at Elias. Mr. Boone, your response. Elias stood. My father and his father before him knew where that line was. It was marked by stones, stones that have been there longer than this town. Those stones are now gone. Pike snorted. Rocks get moved by floods, Boone, or maybe your memory is faulty. The judge sighed, looking from the confident lawyer to the grim-faced rancher. The power in the room, the weight of money and influence, was all on the side of the railroad. Mr. Boone, without your markers, all I have is your word against a registered survey map. It was the moment Mabel had been dreading and preparing for. She felt the eyes of the room on her as she stood. Pike's lawyer gave her a dismissive glance, as if a woman, and a large one at that, could have nothing of substance to add. Your Honor, Mabel began, her voice quiet but steady. The railroad's map is new, but there are older maps of this land. She opened her ledger on the table. The pages were not filled with columns of numbers, but with careful, hand-drawn sketches and notes. The judge leaned forward, intrigued. What is this, Miss? This is a copy of a record, sir, Mabel explained. A record of the boundary markers as they were known by the people who lived here long before the deeds were written in English. The original is a personal journal, belonging to a dying elder. She did not mention how she came by it. The quiet afternoon she had spent at the town smithy. She had brought Mr. Chi, the dying blacksmith, a large portion of the molasses taffy she and Toby had made. He was a man of few words, but he had a deep respect for honest trade and a gentle heart. While she had watched him work, she had admired some old leather-bound books on a shelf. One was filled with drawings of the land, star charts, and notes on plant life. He had seen her interest, And when she offered to help him organize his chaotic pile of invoices and receipts into a proper account book, a skill he sorely lacked, he had been grateful. In exchange for the taffy and her bookkeeping, he had allowed her to spend an afternoon carefully copying the old maps from his grandfather's book into her own ledger. It had seemed like a simple, pleasant exchange at the time. Now, it was their only hope. The railroad's lawyer scoffed. "Your Honor, this is absurd. A book of Indian drawings. We are in a court of territorial law, not a powwow." A low murmur went through the room. Judge Hargrove frowned at the lawyer's disrespectful tone, but his skepticism was plain. "Miss Hart, this is interesting, but it is hardly legal proof." "The proof is not just in the book, Your Honor," a deep voice said from the back of the room. The crowd parted. Mr. Chi, the blacksmith, walked forward. He was a tall, dignified man, his face a testament to a life lived under the sun and by the heat of the forge. He moved with a quiet authority that commanded silence. He stopped beside Mabel's table. "My grandfather drew that map," he said, his voice calm and resonant. "He drew it so his children would remember the sacred places." The boundary of the Boone land was marked by 3 stones. Not just any stones. They were ancestor stones. One shaped like a sleeping bear, one like a serpent's head, one with the mark of a handprint. They were landmarks, but they were also prayers. I have known them since I was a boy. I can take you to the place where they stood. I can show you the hollows in the earth where they rested before they were stolen. The room was utterly still. This was no longer about property lines and water rights. It was about memory, history, and a sacred trust that had been violated. Mr. Chi's testimony was not just an argument. It was a truth that felt as solid and ancient as the stones he described. The railroad's lawyer began to bluster, but the judge held up a hand. Judge Hargrove looked at Pike, whose face was turning a shade of angry red. He looked at the slick lawyer, now momentarily speechless. He looked at Mr. Chi's unwavering, honest face. He was a man of the law, but he was not a fool. He knew he was caught between a powerful corporation and the deep, unwritten laws of the land itself. "I find this testimony compelling," he said slowly. "There is enough doubt cast upon the railroad survey to warrant further investigation. I am placing a 30-day injunction on any work related to the diversion of the creek. During this time, a federal marshal will investigate the matter of the missing markers." It was a victory, but a fragile one. A collective sigh of relief went through the local ranchers in the room. Pike slammed his hand on the table, his face contorted with fury. As people began to file out, Silas Calhoun, the banker, stopped Elias in the doorway. "Congratulations on your little delay. Boone," he said, his voice a venomous whisper. "But do not forget, 30 days from now, your note is still due. And I assure you, there will be no extension." The ride back to the ranch was quiet, the weight of the small victory and the banker's threat settling over them. They worked through the rest of the afternoon in a shared, weary silence, their minds replaying the events of the day. That evening, as they watered the livestock, Elias finally spoke. He stared into the middle distance, his hand resting on the warm, solid flank of a cow. "After my sister's husband, Frank, was killed by a stampede," he began, his voice low and rough. "I was ready to sell this place. The grief was too heavy. The work was too much. I had an offer from a land speculator. I was going to take it." Mabel stopped what she was doing, listening. "But then I looked at June," he continued, "and at little Toby, who was just a baby then. This was their home, the only one they had. It was all Frank had left them. Selling it would have been like burying him all over again. So I stayed. I fought, but I have been fighting alone for so long. I think I forgot how." He turned and looked at her, his gray eyes full of a raw emotion she had never seen before. "Until you came." The confession hung in the air between them, a thing of immense weight and value. Mabel felt her own walls begin to crumble. She thought of her own past, of the reasons she was so determined to prove her worth. "I was engaged once," she said softly, her gaze on her own hands, "to a merchant in the town where my mother and I had our shop. He was a prosperous man. He said he admired my good sense, but a week before the wedding, he called it off. His partners had told him that a wife of my size would not reflect well on his station, that it suggested a lack of refinement." She took a shaky breath. "My mother worked herself into an early grave keeping our shop afloat after my father died. The last thing she told me was never to make myself smaller to fit into someone else's world. I came here to earn a wage, Mr. Boone, but I think I stayed to prove her right." He did not offer empty platitudes or apologies for the cruelty of others. He simply nodded, a deep, knowing understanding passing between them. He understood that her fight for his ranch was inextricably linked to her own fight for a place in the world, a place where her value was not measured by a dressmaker's tape. A moment later, they both reached for the handle of the pump that filled the long wooden water trough. Their hands brushed, then settled together on the cool, worn iron. The contact was brief, accidental, yet it felt charged with everything that had been said and everything that had not. It was a silent, shared pact. The water, the lifeblood of the ranch they were fighting for, gurgled into the trough, a peaceful sound in the twilight. Standing there, with the first stars beginning to appear in the vast, darkening sky, Mabel made a silent promise to herself. Saving this ranch was no longer just a job, or even a matter of principle. It was the measure of her own soul. She would not shrink. She would not fail. And beside her, Elias made his own vow. He would protect this land for his family, but he would also protect this woman, this strong, intelligent, warm woman, from the shallow cruelties of the world. He would be the shield she had never had. The fight was no longer just about land and water. It was about them. The 30-day reprieve was not a time of rest, but a breathless race against the calendar. The victory at the land office had thwarted the railroad, but it had not made it rain, nor had it put money in the bank. The land remained parched, the future uncertain, and then, as if nature itself were conspiring with their enemies, a new crisis emerged. It started with a single Hereford cow, standing listlessly in the corral, her head low, her breath coming in shallow, ragged rasps. By the next day, 2 more were sick, their eyes dull with fever. Elias's face grew even grimmer. He recognized the signs of lung fever, a plague that could sweep through a herd and wipe out a man's entire livelihood in a matter of weeks. They separated the sick animals, a desperate attempt to contain the contagion. The nights grew colder, and Elias spent them in the barn, a lantern casting long, dancing shadows as he watched over the afflicted cows, forcing water and thin mash down their throats. Mabel watched him, her heart aching at his weary, relentless vigil. One evening, as she brought him a plate of beans and cornbread, she saw him sitting with a newborn calf on his lap, the tiny creature too weak to stand. He had wrapped the calf in his own heavy wool coat, his large, rough hands stroking its flank with a tenderness that was almost painful to witness in this quiet, desperate act of care. She saw the true measure of the man. She remembered something from her own childhood. Her mother had kept a small garden of herbs behind their shop, not just for cooking, but for remedies. She had a book of recipes for poultices and tisans, cures passed down through generations. There is a wisdom in the weeds. Mabel, she used to say, you just have to know how to listen to them. Mabel recalled a treatment for coughs and fevers, a bitter brew made from boiled elderflower, yarrow, and peppermint leaf. She had a small supply of the dried herbs in a tin in her valise, a part of the small inheritance her mother had left her. With a quiet determination, she brewed the tea. It smelled pungent and green. She brought a steaming bucket of it to the barn. Elias looked at her concoction with deep skepticism. "What is this?" "It is my mother's remedy for lung ailments," she said simply. "It may not work, but it cannot harm them. We have to try something." He looked from the tea to the struggling animals, then back to her earnest, hopeful face. He had nothing left to lose. Together, they coaxed the sick cows into drinking the bitter liquid. For 2 days, they kept at it, forcing the herbal tea down the animals' throats, watching, waiting, and then, on the 3rd morning, a small miracle. The first cow that had fallen ill was standing, and she was chewing her cud. Her fever had broken. The recovery was slow, agonizingly so, but the tide had turned. They did not lose a single animal. The small victory brought with it a stark realization. Their survival depended on more than just cattle. With the banknote looming, they needed cash, and they needed it now. One afternoon, as she was again mending Elias's saddle, an idea began to form. Her skill with a needle and thread was not just for fabric. The ranchers in the area were hard on their equipment. Saddles tore, bridles snapped, harnesses frayed. She could mend them. With Elias's hesitant approval, she posted a small, neatly lettered sign at the end of their lane: leather goods mended, saddlery and harness repair, fair prices, strong stitches, M. Hart. The first customer was a neighboring rancher's wife, who brought a pair of her husband's riding gloves. The fingers split open. She was a woman who had been coolly polite to Mabel in town, but now her eyes were curious and respectful. Mabel repaired the gloves while the woman waited, her stitches small, even and incredibly strong. The woman paid her a few coins and left with a word of thanks. The next day, 2 more ranchers came, one with a broken rein, another with a saddle blanket that needed patching. The work was slow, but it was steady. The coins she earned were few, but they accumulated. A small but growing pile in a tin box she kept on her bedside table. It was a tiny shield against the coming financial storm, but it was a shield she had forged herself. The community's perception of her was changing. She was no longer just the fat woman staying at the Boone place. She was Miss Hart, the woman who had faced down the railroad lawyer, the woman whose cleverness had made a fool of Foreman Pike, the woman who could put a stitch in leather so strong it would outlast the saddle itself. Other women began to approach her, not with gossip, but with requests for help. One asked her to look over a confusing bill from the general store. Another asked her to help write a difficult letter to family back east. She was becoming a quiet pillar of the community, her worth defined not by her shape, but by her skills and her steady character. The snide laughter in the saloon did not vanish entirely, but it grew quieter, more hesitant, its easy cruelty blunted by a newfound respect. One crisp autumn evening, a neighbor who had successfully brought in his harvest through a celebration. A bonfire was lit in a cleared field, and a fiddler was brought in from the next county. The entire community was there, a rare occasion for rest and fellowship. Elias, who usually avoided such gatherings, allowed himself to be persuaded by June and a hopeful-looking Toby. Mabel wore her best dress, a simple dark blue calico, in the flickering firelight, with the lively music of the fiddle filling the air. The hard lines of people's faces seemed to soften. Couples began to dance in the open space of a swept-clean barn, their boots stomping on the wooden planks. Mabel watched them, a small, wistful smile on her face. Elias stood beside her, his arms crossed over his chest, his posture stiff and uncomfortable. "I am not a dancing man," he said, as if to ward off any ideas she might have. "I am sure the floorboards will survive," she teased gently. A slow tune began, a sweet, plaintive waltz. He looked at the other couples, then at her. He saw the soft glow of the lanterns in her hair, the quiet longing in her eyes. He felt a sudden, unfamiliar urge to bridge the distance between them. "Well," he said, clearing his throat and offering her his hand, perhaps just one. His hand was large and warm around hers. He led her onto the floor, his movements awkward and stiff. He was a man accustomed to the wide-open spaces of the range, not the confined steps of a dance. He counted the beats under his breath, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was clumsy. He stepped on her foot, not once, but twice. He apologized, his face flushing a dark red. Mabel did not mind. She laughed, a genuine bubbling sound of pure delight. The sight of this serious, formidable man so completely out of his element was endearing. Her laughter was infectious, and a small, sheepish grin touched his own lips. They did not speak. They did not need to. They simply moved together, clumsily at first, then finding a slow, easy rhythm. His hand rested on her waist, a light, respectful touch. Yet it sent a current of warmth through her entire body. In the simple, unadorned space of the barn, surrounded by their neighbors, something shifted between them. The partnership forged in work and hardship was softening, blossoming into something more tender, more hopeful. But their enemies were not celebrating. A few days later, Foreman Pike was seen in the High Mesa saloon. He was not with his usual crew of railroad men. He was drinking with a stranger, a man with a cold, watchful stillness about him. The man's name was Hollis. He had a gun belt tied low on his hip, and his eyes, small and dark, missed nothing. He was a man who sold his skill with a gun, and it was clear Pike was buying. That night, a new mark of intimidation appeared. In the pale moonlight, Elias found it on the front door of the house, a crude circle with an X through it, drawn in white chalk. It was a threat, stark and silent. A target had been painted on their home. The blow fell 2 nights later. Mabel was woken from a deep sleep not by a sound, but by a smell, the acrid, biting scent of smoke. And then she saw the light, a hellish, flickering orange glow painting the walls of her small room. She threw on a robe and ran out into the main room. Elias was already there, pulling on his boots, his face a grim silhouette against the window that looked out onto the barn. The barn was on fire. "June!" he yelled. "Get Toby and get to the root cellar." The roar of the fire was a living thing, a hungry beast consuming the dry, aged wood of the barn. Mabel's first thought was of the animals trapped inside. Buttermilk was in the small corral, rearing and screaming with terror, but safe. But the milk cows and the new calves were in the barn. "The calves," Mabel cried, grabbing a bucket. "It is too late," Elias shouted, grabbing her arm. "The roof will go any minute." But she pulled away, her face set with a desperate resolve. "We cannot let them die." He looked at her, then at the inferno. He saw the same fearlessness he had seen the day of the grass fire. Cursing, he grabbed a wet sack from the water barrel and ran after her. June, her face a white mask of terror, clutched a sobbing Toby in her arms and ran for the heavy wooden doors of the root cellar. Elias and Mabel plunged into the blinding, choking smoke of the barn. The heat was a physical force, stealing the air from their lungs. The terrified cries of the cattle were deafening. They worked in a desperate, silent harmony, untying the ropes, driving the panicked animals out into the yard. A heavy beam, eaten through by flames, crashed to the ground just behind them. They rescued the last of the calves, their lungs burning, their eyes streaming, and stumbled out into the night air just as the main roof collapsed inward with a great, whooshing roar, sending a fountain of sparks and embers into the black sky. They stood there, gasping for breath, their faces black with soot, and watched the heart of the ranch burn. The work of a generation was turning to ash before their eyes. It was a devastating, soul-crushing blow. As dawn broke, they surveyed the wreckage. The barn was a smoking, skeletal ruin. The smell of burnt wood and despair hung heavy in the cool morning air. They had saved the animals, but they had lost their shelter, their store of hay, their tools, their history. As Mabel walked the perimeter of the disaster, her eyes scanning the ground for any clue, she saw it, snagged on a rusty nail on a section of the corral fence post. Just near the point where the fire seemed to have been started was a small scrap of dark blue cloth. It was a sturdy, coarse wool, the kind used for work uniforms. She recognized it instantly. It was the exact same color and fabric as the jackets worn by the Silver Spur Railroad men. She carefully worked it free from the nail and folded it into the palm of her hand. It was small, it was fragile, but in the gray light of their ruin, it felt as heavy and as solid as a stone. It was their second piece of proof. The second hearing was held in the town's small wooden church, the only building large enough to hold the crowd that had gathered. The mood was vastly different from the last time. The burning of the Boone barn had sent a tremor of fear and anger through the community. This was no longer a dispute over property lines. It was an assault. The air was thick with tension, the benches packed with grim-faced ranchers and their wives. This time, Silas Calhoun and Foreman Pike were not alone. They were accompanied by a lawyer from back east, a man with a tailored suit, polished shoes, and a face that held the easy arrogance of someone who had never known a day of physical labor. He spoke with the clipped, confident accent of a man who believed the law was an instrument to be played, not a principle to be upheld. He represented not just the Silver Spur Railroad, but the weight of federal contracts and Washington influence. Judge Hargrove looked even more weary than before. He sat at a simple table placed before the altar, the stark wooden cross on the wall behind him, a silent witness to the proceedings. He called the meeting to order, his voice strained. The railroad's lawyer began, his tone condescending. He dismissed the barn fire as a tragic accident, perhaps caused by a stray spark or faulty lantern, and he expressed his client's deepest sympathies. He then moved on to the matter at hand, dismissing Mr. Chee's testimony as sentimental folklore and Mabel's hand-drawn map as the amateurish scribbling of an unqualified woman. He presented affidavits and letters from powerful men, painting a picture of progress and prosperity that the railroad would bring, a future being held hostage by one stubborn, backward rancher. When he was finished, a smug silence settled over the railroad side of the room. Judge Hargrove turned to Elias. "Mr. Boone." Before Elias could speak, a man moved to stand in the open doorway of the church. It was Hollis, the hired gun. He leaned against the doorframe, his thumbs hooked in his low-slung gun belt, a lazy smirk on his face. His presence was a physical threat, a silent underscore to the lawyer's words. The people on the benches shifted uncomfortably. It was Mabel who stood to speak. She placed her ledger on the judge's table, her movements calm and deliberate. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and carrying to the back of the room. "The lawyer is correct. I am not a surveyor. I am a bookkeeper." From her pocket, she carefully took out the flimsy carbon receipt she had found in Calhoun's discarded papers. "This is a receipt from Silas Calhoun's bank. It details an interest payment from a man who lost his ranch last year. The rate of interest charged, noted in Mr. Calhoun's own hand, is nearly twice the legal limit for this territory. It seems the bank is as careless with the law as the railroad is with its survey stakes." A gasp went through the crowd. Silas Calhoun shot to his feet, his face purple with rage. "This is an outrage. That is stolen property. It was purchased at public auction." "Mr. Calhoun?" Mabel said calmly. She then took out the small, folded scrap of dark blue wool. "And this," she continued, holding it up, "was found snagged on a nail near the point of origin for the fire that destroyed the Boone barn. It is a perfect match for the wool used in the uniforms of the Silver Spur work crews." Foreman Pike lunged forward. "That proves nothing. It is a plant." The room erupted into shouts. Judge Hargrove banged his gavel, calling for order. At that moment, Toby, who had been sitting quietly beside June, grew frightened by the noise and ran toward the front of the church, toward the safety of his uncle. He darted out into the open doorway. Hollis, the gunman, uncoiled from the doorframe. He drew his pistol, the movement a blur of deadly grace. "Everyone stay put," he drawled, his voice cold. He was not aiming at anyone, but the gesture was meant to quell the uprising, to reassert control through fear. But Toby was in the way, a small, terrified figure frozen in the doorway. Hollis raised the pistol, intending to fire a shot into the sky to scatter the crowd. The crack of the pistol was a sound that did not belong in the house of God. a violent desecration of the sacred space. Elias moved faster than Mabel had ever seen him move. He threw himself forward, shoving Toby behind him, shielding the boy's body with his own. The bullet, meant for the sky, tore through the fleshy part of Elias's left shoulder. It was a shallow wound, a long, burning graze, but the impact spun him around. He stumbled, clutching his arm, blood welling dark and immediate against the pale fabric of his shirt. A collective scream went through the church. The violence was no longer a threat. It was real, and it had drawn blood in front of them all. The patience of the town of High Mesa, already worn thin, finally snapped. This was the moment of choosing. A line had been drawn, not in the dust, but in the hearts of the people. Mr. Chi was the first to move. He rose from his bench and walked to the front, standing silently behind Mabel. Then the town priest, a small, balding man who had until now remained neutral, walked purposefully from behind the altar and stood beside him. Another rancher stood, then two more. They were not gunmen or brawlers. They were quiet, hard-working men, and their silent movement was more powerful than any shouted threat. They formed a human wall behind Elias and Mabel. Then, the most unexpected thing happened. Matron Hester, the arbiter of the town's social order, the woman whose disapproving gaze had so wounded Mabel on her first day, rose from her seat. She stood for a long, agonizing moment, her thin lips pressed together, her eyes darting from the bleeding Elias to the arrogant lawyer to the sneering gunman. A battle was being fought within her, between her rigid adherence to established power and her dawning recognition of true injustice. With a deliberate, almost painful slowness, she lifted her chin, walked across the center aisle, and took her place beside June. The war was over. The town had chosen its side. Mabel turned back to the judge, her own fear and anger now forged into a cold, hard clarity. She looked directly at the lawyer and Silas Calhoun. "I do not have a tiny waist," she said, her voice ringing with a strength that came from the very core of her being. "But I have numbers, I have records, and I have facts. And the numbers say that you are cheating. The facts say that you are liars and thieves, and now you are violent men who would see a child harmed." Judge Hargrove looked at the faces of the people standing behind Elias Boone. He looked at the blood on Elias's shirt, at the smoking gun in Hollis's hand. He was a man of the law, and he saw that the law was on the verge of collapsing into anarchy. He made his decision. "This hearing is concluded," he announced, his voice booming with a newfound authority. "I am issuing a binding injunction against the Silver Spur Railroad and the High Mesa Bank, pending a full federal investigation into their business practices, the setting of the fire, and the theft of the boundary markers. Hollis, you are to surrender your weapon to me immediately. You are under arrest." As two of the ranchers moved to disarm the stunned gunman, a strange, low moaning sound began outside. The bright sunlight filtering through the church windows dimmed, turning a sickly, yellowish brown. The wind, which had been a constant, gentle pressure, began to howl. They left the church and stepped into a world that was dissolving. A sandstorm, one of the terrible, blinding furies of the high desert, was descending upon the town. The sky was gone, replaced by a churning, boiling wall of dust. The world dissolved into a screaming, brown chaos. Visibility dropped to a few feet. People shouted, their voices snatched away by the wind. In the confusion, Elias, weakened by his wound, grabbed Mabel's hand. "The creek," he yelled over the roar. "We have to get to the creek bed. It will offer some shelter." They ran, heads down, against the punishing force of the wind. Sand and grit scoured their faces, blinding them. They reached the edge of the creek, the same disputed ribbon of land that had started it all. The bank was steep, eroded by the wind. Mabel, her footing unsure, slipped on a patch of loose shale. She cried out as her ankle twisted, and she fell, sliding toward the rocky bottom. Elias, without a thought for his own injured arm, lunged after her. He caught her, his good arm wrapping around her waist, his body shielding hers from the storm. They tumbled the last few feet together, landing in a heap in the relative shelter of the embankment. The wind howled over their heads, a physical, malevolent presence. He was the only solid thing in a world that had come apart. She was pressed against him, her face buried in his chest. She could feel the frantic, steady beat of his heart against her cheek. He held her tight, his grip a promise of safety in the heart of the maelstrom. In that moment, there were no ledgers, no lawsuits, no tiny waists or warm arms. There was only the roar of the world ending, and the two of them, holding on, breathing the same dusty air, alive, together. The world returned slowly. The roar of the sandstorm faded, replaced by an almost unnatural silence. The air, thick with a brown haze, tasted of wet dust and ozone. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world scoured and strangely peaceful. Elias pushed himself up, his face a mask of dirt, his injured shoulder sending a sharp, grinding protest through his body. He helped Mabel to her feet. Her ankle throbbed, but she could put weight on it. They stood for a moment in the quiet of the creek bed, two survivors on a new and barren shore. The walk back to the ranch was a slow, painful pilgrimage through a transformed landscape. Fences were gone, buried under drifts of sand. A lone wagon stood on its side, its wheels spinning slowly in the last gasps of the wind. When they finally saw the adobe house, still standing solid and defiant against the bruised-looking sky, a wave of profound relief washed over Mabel. It was wounded, but it was home. June threw the door open before they reached the porch, her face pale with a terror she had been holding at bay for hours. She saw the blood caked on Elias's shirt, and her hand flew to her mouth.
"Oh, Elias,"
she whispered. "It is just a graze," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion.
"Toby, he is asleep,"
June said, her voice trembling. He slept through the worst of it. Inside, the kitchen was a haven of lamp-lit warmth and order. The storm had not breached its thick walls, while June bolted the door and began to heat water on the stove. Mabel guided Elias to a chair at the table. He slumped into it, the strength that had sustained him through the fight and the storm finally deserting him. He looked pale and vulnerable, the wound on his shoulder a dark, ugly tear in the fabric of his invincibility. Mabel took charge. Her voice was calm, her hand steady. "June, I will need clean cloths, your sharpest needle, and the strongest thread you have. And that whiskey." June moved without question, her earlier suspicion of Mabel now completely replaced by a deep, trusting reliance. Mabel carefully cut away the torn, bloody fabric of Elias's shirt. The wound was long and ragged, the edges full of grit and sand. He flinched as she began to clean it. His jaw clenched tight, but he did not make a sound. He simply watched her, his gray eyes dark with pain and a new, unguarded emotion. He was putting his well-being in her hands, a surrender of control that was more intimate than any touch. She worked with the same focused precision she brought to her ledgers and her leather work. She flushed the wound with whiskey, dislodging the last of the dirt. He hissed, a sharp intake of breath, but his eyes never left her face. She threaded the needle, her movements deft and sure. "This will not be pleasant," she said softly. "Just do it," he rasped. She stitched the torn flesh together, her head bent low in concentration. Each stitch was a small, deliberate act of mending, of putting back together what the world's violence had torn apart. The room was silent save for the hiss of the lamp, the gentle bubbling of soup on the stove, and the faint, rasping sound of the thread passing through skin. June stood by the stove, her back to them, giving them their privacy, her own fear and love for her brother a palpable presence in the room. Outside the kitchen door, Buttermilk stood a quiet, patient vigil, her dark eyes fixed on the lighted window. a silent guardian for the family within. When Mabel was finished, she bandaged the wound with clean linen. Her hands were gentle on his skin. He was feverish, his body trembling slightly with shock and exhaustion. She helped him drink a hot, sweet broth that June had ladled into a mug. He leaned back in the chair, his eyes closing, and for the first time, he looked not like a fighter, but simply like a man in desperate need of rest. The next few days passed in a blur of weary recovery. The news from town trickled in, brought by a neighbor. The federal marshal had arrived. Hollis was in the county jail. Foreman Pike had vanished, disappearing like a snake into the chaparral. And Silas Calhoun, after a long and reportedly shouting interview with the marshal, was confined to High Mesa, his bank's records under official review. It was good news, but it was a distant victory. The immediate problem was closer, more tangible. The note at the bank was still due. They had 10 days. Mabel sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open. The tin box of her mending money was beside it. The numbers were stark and final. Even with the money she had earned, they were short, desperately short. Elias, his arm in a sling, and June, her face etched with worry, sat opposite her.
"There is only one way,"
Mabel said, her voice heavy. She hated the words before she even spoke them.
"We have to sell the new calves. All of them. It is the only asset we have that can be turned to cash quickly enough."
The words landed in the quiet room with a devastating thud. The calves were the future. They were the product of a year's hard labor, the promise of the herd's growth, the embodiment of every hope Elias had for the ranch. Selling them was like selling the next chapter of their lives before it had been written. Elias stared at his hands, resting on the wooden table. A muscle worked in his jaw. Mabel could feel the agony of the decision radiating from him. It was a choice between a quick death and a slow one, between losing the land now or crippling its future. He looked at June, at her tired, fearful face. He looked at the doorway to the room where Toby was sleeping, and then he looked at Mabel. He saw not a bookkeeper presenting numbers, but a partner sharing a terrible burden. He trusted her facts, but more than that, he trusted her heart. He raised his head, and his eyes were clear.
"Sell them,"
he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. The town that had once mocked them now came to their aid. The seeds of support that had sprouted in the church blossomed into a quiet, powerful movement. Mr. Chi arrived one morning, not with words of sympathy, but with a new, heavy iron lock he had forged in his smithy, a silent gift of security. The baker's wife came with sacks of flour and cornmeal, pressing them into June's hands and refusing any payment. A group of young men from the neighboring ranches, their faces grim with a shared sense of outrage, appeared with hammers, saws, and salvaged lumber. They began to clear the wreckage of the barn and raise the frame of a temporary stable, their steady, rhythmic work a balm to the wounded landscape. Justice, Mabel realized, was not just a verdict delivered by a judge. It was the sound of a neighbor's hammer. One afternoon, Matron Hester walked up the path to the house. She carried a freshly baked apple pie, holding it before her like a flag of truce. She looked awkward, her usual severe posture softened by an unfamiliar uncertainty. She stopped on the porch where Mabel was sorting through a box of salvaged nails. "June told me what happened," she said, not quite meeting Mabel's eyes. She held out the pie. "This is for the household." "That is very kind of you, Matron Hester," Mabel said, genuinely surprised. The older woman cleared her throat, a faint blush on her high cheekbones. She looked at Mabel, at her sturdy frame and the smudge of soot on her cheek. "You should eat this, Miss Hart," she said, her voice a low, conspiratorial murmur, "before you get too thin." For a moment, Mabel could only stare. Then a laugh, a real, unburdened laugh, escaped her. June, who had come to the door, heard the remark and she began to laugh too. Even Elias, who was sitting in the shade of the porch, let out a low chuckle that shook his injured shoulder. Matron Hester herself cracked a small, tight smile, in that shared, unexpected moment of humor. The last of the town's old wounds began to heal. That night, after June and Toby were asleep, Elias and Mabel sat on the porch steps. A cool breeze had finally blown away the last of the dust, and the sky was a vast, clear sheet of black velvet, studded with a brilliant spray of stars. The air was quiet, filled with the scent of clean earth and the faint, sweet smell of freshly cut pine from the new stable frame. Elias shifted, his shoulder obviously paining him. He looked at her, his face serious in the starlight. "The calves are sold," he said. "The money will be here tomorrow. We will have enough to pay the bank." He paused, his gaze dropping to his own hands. "We will have the land, but not much else." He reached out his good hand and laid it gently over hers, where it rested on the step beside him. His touch was warm and calloused, a quiet anchor in the vast silence. "Stay," he said, the single word, a question, a plea, and a promise all at once. "Stay with us, Mabel." Mabel looked at their joined hands. She thought of the long, lonely road that had brought her here. She thought of the humiliation, the struggle, the fire, and the fear. And she thought of this man, this quiet, wounded, honorable man, who had seen her, truly seen her, not for her size, but for her strength. Her heart was too full for words. She did not answer him. She simply turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his. 2 days later, the post rider came. Not with a letter, but with a parcel. It was wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, its surface covered in the dust of a long journey. It was addressed simply to the occupant. Boone Ranch, Elias. His curiosity piqued, carefully cut the string. Inside, nestled in a bed of wood shavings, was a thick leather-bound document and a letter. The letter was from a law firm in Ohio. It explained that they were settling the estate of the last descendant of the man who had originally owned this land, before selling it to Elias's grandfather. In clearing out an old safe, they had found this original deed and were legally bound to forward it to the current property owner. It was an interesting curiosity, but nothing more, until Mabel began to read the fine, spidery script of the deed itself. Her eyes scanned the legal language, her mind trained to find the crucial detail. Moving quickly, and then she found it. On the last page, in a separately notarized addendum dated before the railroad had even laid its first track in the territory, was a clause. It was an easement, granting the property and its successive owners first perpetual and uncontestable rights to the water of the adjacent creek, for the purposes of sustaining life and livestock, in a measure never to be diminished by the commercial or industrial pursuits of any other party. She looked up at Elias, her heart hammering against her ribs. She read the passage aloud, her voice trembling with the enormity of what she had found. It was not just a defense against a crooked survey. It was an ironclad, legally binding right that predated the Silver Spur Railroad's very existence. They had been fighting to save the ranch. They had just been handed the weapon that would win the war. The old deed was not a weapon that needed to be fired. Its mere existence was a surrender. They presented the document to Judge Hargrove, who convened a final, brief hearing in his land office. The atmosphere was starkly different. There was no crowd, no tension. The railroad's lawyer from back east was gone, having departed on the first available train. Foreman Pike, it was confirmed, had not been seen in the territory for days. Only Silas Calhoun remained, a diminished figure who stood before the judge's desk, his usual bluster replaced by a deflated, sagging posture. The judge read the addendum from the old deed into the official record, his voice clear and final. He signed a new order, formally recognizing the Boone Ranch's primary and perpetual water rights. The railroad's claim was not just denied. It was rendered void, a legal fiction that had evaporated in the face of incontestable truth. The fight was over. Calhoun did not argue. He did not protest. He simply looked at Elias and Mabel, a flicker of his old arrogance mixed with a new, sour resentment. "The banknote is still due," he said, his voice lacking its former authority. "The date has not changed." "The note will be paid," Elias said, his voice even. "In full." Later that day, Calhoun sent a message, requesting a private meeting to discuss a mutually beneficial arrangement regarding the interest payments and the ongoing federal investigation into his bank. Elias sent a message back with a messenger. It contained a single word: no. Justice, they had learned, was not about negotiation. With the threat of the railroad gone, the sale of the calves was no longer an act of desperation, but a sound business decision. They got a good price, better than they would have in a forced sale. On the day the note was due, Mabel walked into the High Mesa Bank alone. She counted out the full amount onto the counter. The silver and paper currency, a solid, tangible representation of their victory. She took the signed and canceled note, folded it neatly, and walked out without a word, leaving Silas Calhoun to stew in the silence of his defeat. Back at the ranch, they were debt-free for the first time in years. But Mabel knew that freedom was a fragile thing. With the money left over from the sale, she established a new section in her ledger, a contingency fund. A small amount from every future sale would be set aside, a buffer against the inevitable hardships of the land drought. Sickness, fire. It was a practice of foresight, a way of building a fortress of security, $1 at a time. Her influence, born of clear thinking and earned respect, now extended beyond the Boone property. She called a meeting of the local ranchers, the same men who had stood with them in the church, in the half-built frame of the new barn. She laid out a plan. She proposed a community water convention, a simple, handwritten agreement that they all would sign. It stipulated a fair and equitable sharing of the creek's resources during times of drought, with allotments based on herd size and household need. It was a law of their own making, based not on corporate greed but on neighborly survival. They argued over details, but in the end, they all signed. They were no longer isolated homesteads, fighting their own battles. They were a community, bound by a shared resource and a common understanding. Life settled into a new, peaceful rhythm. The days were still long and filled with hard work, but the edge of desperation was gone, replaced by a sense of hopeful purpose. The new barn rose, its fresh pine timbers smelling of resilience and new beginnings. Elias, his shoulder now healed, though still stiff, worked on building a new gate for the main corral, his hammer blows ringing out in the clear, cool air. He was a quiet man, but Mabel saw the change in him. The tight, defensive lines around his eyes had softened. He moved with a lighter step, a man no longer carrying the weight of the world alone. Mabel found her own place in the rhythms of the community. Several afternoons a week, the neighboring children would gather on the porch of the adobe house. She taught them their letters, using a piece of charcoal on a smooth plank of wood. She taught them to count, not with beads or blocks, but with handfuls of dried corn kernels, a lesson in both arithmetic and the value of a harvest. They were a noisy, cheerful, wriggling group, and she found a deep, quiet joy in their presence. Buttermilk grew sleek and strong, her coat now the rich, creamy color of her name. She would follow Mabel around the ranch yard like a large, gentle dog, a living, breathing symbol of how a thing discarded could be nurtured back to life and beauty. One evening, after a long day of work, Elias and Mabel sat on the porch steps, watching the sunset, painting the western sky in strokes of fiery orange and deep purple. It was a comfortable silence, the kind that exists between two people who have no need to fill the space with empty words. Elias had been quiet all through supper, a thoughtful, almost solemn look on his face. He rose and went into the house. When he returned, he was holding something in his hand. It was her mother's handkerchief, the one with the small, embroidered forget-me-nots. Mabel watched, puzzled. As he knelt on the porch, he had washed it, she realized, and he had carefully pressed it, the fine linen smooth and clean. He spread it out on the dusty top step. A small, perfect square of white in the fading light. He remained there for a moment, his head bowed. When he looked up at her, his gray eyes were full of a deep, unwavering sincerity. He spoke, his voice low and a little rough, repeating the words that had first bridged the chasm between them, but filling them now with a new and profound meaning. "I need warm arms," he said softly, "not a tiny waist." He took her hand, his calloused palm enveloping hers. "Stay, Mabel, stay, and be my wife." The world seemed to stop. The chirping of the crickets, the sigh of the evening breeze, it all fell away. There was only his face, earnest and open in the twilight, and the feel of his hand holding hers. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the perfect, beautiful stars that were beginning to appear. They were not tears of sadness or even relief, but of a joy so deep and unexpected it felt like a kind of pain. She smiled, a wobbly, tear-streaked smile. "Oh, Elias," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I already decided to stay. I stayed the day we counted cattle together under that hot sun." He let out a long, shaky breath, a sound of profound relief. He rose and sat beside her on the step, his hand still holding hers. He leaned in, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not one of fiery passion, but of deep, quiet homecoming. It was gentle and long, a sharing of breath, a sealing of promises. It tasted of dust and wood smoke and the faint, salty tang of her own tears. She could feel the steady, reassuring beat of his heart through his shirt, a rhythm that matched her own. The air around them was filled with the clean, warm scent of the new pine timbers of the barn, the smell of a future they would build together. A week later, they held a celebration to dedicate the new barn. The entire community came. The long, open space was decorated with lanterns and wildflowers. A fiddler played lively tunes from one corner, his banjo player keeping a cheerful rhythm. Long trestle tables groaned under the weight of food brought by every family: roasted chickens, bowls of beans, fresh baked bread, and a dozen different kinds of pie. Mabel, standing beside Elias, wore a new dress she had made, a simple calico the color of a summer sky. She watched the faces around her, faces that had once been closed and judgmental, now open and smiling. Mr. Chi was there, sharing a quiet conversation with the priest. June was laughing, a bright, carefree sound, as she watched Toby chase the other children through the hay. Matron Hester approached them, a plate of food in her hand and a surprisingly cheerful look on her face. She looked from Elias to Mabel, a twinkle in her sharp eyes. She leaned toward Elias and winked, a gesture so unexpected it made him blink. "You see that you keep her well fed, young man," she said, her voice a loud, theatrical whisper. Elias looked at Mabel, a slow, warm smile spreading across his face. He wrapped his arm around her waist, a comfortable, possessive gesture that felt as natural as breathing. "That," he said, his voice full of a quiet, happy confidence, "is a promise I intend to keep." The music played on. The lanterns glowed, and the laughter of their friends and neighbors filled the new barn. The land outside was still harsh, the winters still long, the winds still sharp. High Mesa had not changed, but the people had. They had learned that the laws of men and the laws of water could be made to run straight and true, and Mabel Hart and Elias Boone, standing together in the warm, golden light, knew that love was not about finding shelter from the storm. It was about holding each other and keeping each other warm through every season of the wind. Thank you for listening. We invite you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with our community, and ask you to please subscribe to Wild West Night, like the video, and press the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.